Sometimes the smallest act of kindness quietly changes the course of someone else's life. The wind howled across the empty highway outside Willow Creek like a restless spirit searching for shelter, rattling the diner's old windows and pushing thin ribbons of snow against the glass. Inside, Emily Carter wiped down the last table of the night at Willow Creek Diner, her breath fogging faintly in the warm air as the heater hummed above the kitchen door. At 27, Emily had learned to move through quiet evenings like this without expecting much from the world. The diner sat nearly 2 miles off Route 41, the kind of roadside place truck drivers stopped at for hot coffee and homemade pie. Most nights were simple. Coffee refills, friendly smiles, the quiet rhythm of plates and silverware. Tonight, though, the storm had driven everyone away hours earlier. Outside, the temperature had dropped to barely 15 degrees, and the snowfall had thickened into a blinding curtain that swallowed the road beyond the parking lot. Emily glanced at the clock above the soda fountain. 9:47 p.m. closing time. She reached for the light switch near the counter when something moved beyond the frosted glass door. At first she thought it was just snow blowing sideways under the yellow parking lot lamp. Then the shape shifted again. Small. Unsteady. Emily paused, her hand hovering in the air. The bell above the diner door jingled softly as she opened it, and a gust of freezing wind rushed inside, carrying with it 2 boys who looked no older than 8 or 9. Their jackets were thin, dusted with snow, and their cheeks were pale from the cold. The smaller one clutched the other's sleeve as if letting go might mean disappearing into the storm again. For a moment, they simply stood there, blinking under the diner lights, unsure whether they were welcome. Emily knelt down so her eyes were level with theirs. "Hey there," she said gently, brushing snow from the younger boy's shoulders. "You two okay?" The older boy nodded, though his lips trembled slightly. "We just needed somewhere warm for a little while." Emily looked past them toward the empty road. Nothing. No headlights. No cars. Just wind and snow swirling across the pavement. She stepped aside and held the door open wider. "Come on in," she said. "Storm like this isn't something anyone should be out in." The boys hesitated only a second before stepping inside, their shoes leaving wet prints across the checkered floor. Emily closed the door behind them and guided them toward a booth near the heater. Up close, she noticed their clothes were well made, far nicer than anything most kids around Willow Creek wore. The older boy's backpack rested against the booth seat, and on his wrist glinted a small watch that looked surprisingly expensive. But Emily didn't ask questions. Not yet. Instead, she grabbed 2 thick mugs from the counter and poured steaming tomato soup from the pot she'd been about to throw out for the night. A minute later, she placed the bowls in front of them, along with grilled cheese sandwiches cut into neat triangles. The boys stared at the food like it might disappear if they blinked. "Go ahead," Emily said with a soft smile. "Eat while it's hot." Outside, the storm raged harder, pressing snow against the diner windows in swirling white waves. Inside, the only sound was the quiet clink of spoons and the low hum of the heater. Emily watched them for a moment, arms folded loosely as they ate, and something deep in her chest stirred with a familiar memory. Years ago, when she had been a child herself, standing outside a locked door with nowhere to go. She had promised herself back then that if she ever had the chance, she would always open the door for someone else. So when the younger boy finished his soup and looked up with tired eyes, Emily simply smiled and said the one thing she wished someone had said to her all those years ago. "Don't worry," she told them softly. "You can stay here tonight." The warmth of the diner slowly returned to the boys' faces as the storm continued to roar outside, like an ocean crashing against invisible cliffs. Emily moved quietly around the small kitchen, rinsing dishes and wiping down the counter, while keeping one eye on the booth where the 2 boys sat. They ate slowly now, not with the desperate hunger from before, but with the careful politeness of children who had clearly been taught good manners. The older boy, who looked about 9 years old, finished his sandwich and folded the napkin neatly beside his bowl. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his voice calm despite the exhaustion in his eyes. Emily smiled gently and leaned against the edge of the booth. "You are very welcome. I am Emily. What are your names?" The younger boy glanced at his brother before answering. "I am Lucas." The older one nodded. "And I am Noah." Emily repeated their names softly, committing them to memory the way people in small towns often did. "Well, Noah and Lucas, you picked the right place to stop tonight. This diner might not look like much, but it is the warmest building for about 10 miles. Lucas looked toward the window where snow slid down the glass in thick waves. It is really bad out there. Yes, it is, Emily said, following his gaze. Weather report said the storm might last all night. Noah sat a little straighter in the booth. Our driver said the same thing before the car stopped working. Emily raised an eyebrow slightly. Your driver? Noah seemed to realize he had said more than he meant to. He glanced at Lucas again before quietly adding, we were coming back from the city. The car broke down on the highway. The driver went to find help, but told us to stay near the road. We walked until we saw your lights. Emily listened carefully, but did not interrupt. Something about the way Noah spoke felt older than his years, calm and deliberate like someone used to responsibility. She studied their clothes again. The jackets were high quality. Their shoes were expensive leather boots. And the small watch on Noah's wrist was something she had only ever seen behind glass counters in jewelry stores. These were not children who usually walked along dark highways during winter storms. Still, Emily did not press them for details. Instead, she slid out of the booth and grabbed 2 thick wool blankets from the storage closet near the hallway. All right, she said as she draped one blanket over each boy's shoulders. Here's the plan. The diner has a small back room where the staff usually takes breaks. There is a couch back there and a heater that works better than the one out here. You two can rest there until the storm passes. Lucas's eyes widened. Really? Of course really, Emily replied softly. No one is sending kids back out into that weather. Noah hesitated before speaking again. We do not want to cause trouble. Emily chuckled quietly and placed a reassuring hand on the table. Trust me, trouble is when the pie burns or the coffee machine breaks. Helping 2 cold boys is not trouble. For the first time that night, Lucas smiled. Emily led them down the short hallway toward the back room, where a small lamp cast a warm yellow glow across an old couch, and a worn quilt folded neatly on the armrest. She turned on the heater, and the room filled with a gentle hum. There we go, she said. Not a 5-star hotel, but it will keep you warm. The boys settled onto the couch, their shoulders finally relaxing as the warmth wrapped around them. Emily paused in the doorway for a moment before switching off the hallway light. Outside, the storm continued to rage across Willow Creek, but inside the quiet diner the night felt a little safer. What Emily did not know was that somewhere miles away, along the frozen stretch of highway they had walked from, an entire team of people had begun searching through the storm for 2 missing boys. The storm did not quiet during the night. It moved across Willow Creek like a living thing, pressing snow against the diner windows and rattling the old metal sign above the roof. Inside, however, the little building had settled into a peaceful silence. The heater hummed steadily, the kitchen lights glowed softly, and the scent of toasted bread and tomato soup still lingered faintly in the air. Emily Carter finished locking the front door and flipped the sign to close before turning off the main dining lights. Only the warm lamps above the counter remained on, casting long golden reflections across the checkered floor. She moved quietly through the diner, the way someone does when they know others are sleeping nearby. After wiping the last clean dish dry, she walked down the short hallway toward the break room. The door stood slightly open. Inside, Noah and Lucas had fallen asleep almost immediately. Lucas was curled up against the arm of the couch, the blanket wrapped around him like a cocoon. Noah lay beside him, one arm draped protectively across his younger brother's shoulder, even in sleep. Emily leaned gently against the doorframe, watching them for a moment. Children always looked younger when they slept. The tension had disappeared from Noah's face, and Lucas's breathing had slowed into the deep rhythm of someone who finally felt safe. Emily stepped inside quietly and adjusted the blanket around Lucas's shoulders. The heater clicked softly beside the wall, pushing warm air into the room. You are all right now, she whispered under her breath, though the boys did not wake. She turned off the lamp and closed the door halfway before returning to the front of the diner. Outside, snow continued to fall in thick waves, covering the parking lot in a white blanket nearly 6 inches deep. The road beyond had vanished entirely beneath drifting snow. Emily poured herself a cup of coffee and sat at the counter, wrapping both hands around the warm mug. Nights like this always made the world feel smaller, quieter, almost suspended in time. Her phone rested beside the register. The local weather alert still blinked across the screen. Severe winter storm warning. Travel not advised. She wondered where the boys had really come from and how far they had walked before finding the diner lights glowing in the dark. Somewhere out there, someone was probably worried about them. But with the storm raging like this, there was little anyone could do until morning. Emily finished her coffee and eventually stretched out on the small bench behind the counter, using her folded jacket as a pillow. The hours passed slowly. The wind eased sometime before dawn, and the snowfall softened into quiet flurries. By 6:30 in the morning, a pale gray light began to spread across the sky beyond the frosted windows. Emily woke to the gentle buzz of the coffee machine timer starting its morning cycle. She sat up, rubbing sleep from her eyes, and glanced outside. The storm had left Willow Creek buried beneath nearly a foot of snow. The road was still empty. No cars. No trucks. Just silence. She stood, started a fresh pot of coffee, and began preparing the diner for the morning shift the way she did every day. Bacon sizzling in the pan. Eggs stacked beside the grill. The smell of breakfast slowly filling the room. Down the hallway, she could hear faint movement from the break room as the boys began to wake. Emily smiled softly to herself and reached for 3 plates instead of 1. What she did not hear yet was the distant sound far down the snow-covered road. The low rumble of engines. Not one vehicle. Many. And they were heading straight toward the quiet little diner at the edge of Willow Creek. The morning light spread slowly across Willow Creek, reflecting off the thick blanket of snow that covered the empty highway and the quiet parking lot outside the diner. Inside, warmth and the smell of breakfast filled the air. Bacon sizzled gently on the grill while the coffee machine gurgled and steamed behind the counter. Emily Carter moved with the calm rhythm of someone who had started hundreds of mornings exactly the same way. Plates stacked. Eggs cracked carefully into the pan. Toast sliding into the old chrome toaster beside the register. Down the hallway, she heard the soft creak of the break room door opening. A moment later, Noah stepped into the diner, still wrapped in the wool blanket from the night before. Lucas followed close behind, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Their hair was slightly messy from the couch, but the warmth had brought color back to their faces. Emily turned from the stove and smiled. "Good morning, you two. Did you sleep all right?" Lucas nodded quickly, his eyes drifting toward the smell of food. "Yes, ma'am. It was very warm." Noah looked around the diner, as if making sure everything from the night before had been real. "Thank you for letting us stay." Emily waved a hand toward the counter. "Breakfast is almost ready. Go ahead and sit down." The boys climbed onto the stools by the counter, their feet swinging slightly above the floor as Emily placed 2 plates in front of them. Scrambled eggs, toast with butter, and a few slices of bacon. Lucas stared at the plate with quiet amazement. "This looks really good." Emily poured them each a glass of orange juice and set the glasses down beside their plates. "Eat up while it is hot." For a few minutes the diner filled with nothing but the quiet sounds of forks tapping against plates and the low hum of the heater. Outside, the sky had brightened to a pale winter blue. The storm clouds were finally breaking apart, revealing the sun for the first time since the night before. Emily leaned against the counter, sipping her coffee while she watched the road through the front window. Snowplows would probably start clearing the highway soon. Once the roads reopened, someone would likely come, looking for the boys. She wondered again who their family might be. The way Noah carried himself suggested a household where responsibility mattered. And Lucas, despite his younger age, spoke with careful politeness that was rarely taught by accident. Just as Emily reached to refill the coffee pot, a low rumbling sound drifted through the quiet morning air. At first it was distant, almost easy to mistake for the wind moving through the hills. But within seconds the sound grew stronger. Engines. More than one. Emily frowned slightly and stepped toward the front window. The boys noticed her expression and turned to look as well. Far down the snow-covered highway, dark shapes began to appear against the bright, white landscape. Vehicles. Large ones. They moved slowly at first, pushing through the snow-covered road like a line of dark shadows. As they drew closer, the shapes became clear. Black SUVs. One after another. 5. Then 8. Then more. The small convoy rolled steadily toward Willow Creek, tires crunching through the packed snow as sunlight flashed across their polished surfaces. Emily blinked in disbelief. It was rare enough for one luxury vehicle to pass through the town. Seeing a whole line of them heading directly toward the diner felt almost unreal. The first SUV turned carefully into the parking lot, followed by the others. Engines idled softly as the vehicles came to a stop outside the front windows. Inside the diner, Noah had gone completely still. His fork rested halfway to his plate. Lucas leaned forward on the stool, eyes wide with sudden recognition. The driver's door of the lead SUV opened slowly. A tall man stepped out, his dark coat brushing lightly against the snow as he straightened to his full height. He scanned the diner windows with sharp, searching eyes. And the moment Noah saw him, he slid off the stool and whispered one quiet word that changed the entire morning. "Dad." The word hung in the air like a quiet echo. "Dad." Emily Carter blinked once, certain she must have misheard it. But the moment Noah said it, everything in the diner seemed to shift. Outside, the tall man who had stepped from the lead SUV moved quickly through the snow toward the front door, his long stride cutting across the white parking lot with purpose. Behind him, several other men stepped out of the vehicles, scanning the area with serious expressions, but the tall man did not slow down. His attention was fixed entirely on the diner windows. Inside, Lucas slid off his stool and hurried toward the door, his small boots tapping against the tile floor. Noah followed close behind, his calm expression from earlier replaced by something that looked like relief. Emily stood frozen behind the counter as the diner bell chimed loudly when the door opened. Cold winter air rushed inside along with the tall man in the dark coat. Up close he looked even more commanding. Early 40s perhaps, with sharp features and steady gray eyes that carried the weight of someone used to making decisions that affected many people. But the moment those eyes landed on the two boys standing a few feet away, that powerful presence changed instantly. "Noah." "Lucas." His voice was deep, steady, but filled with a kind of relief that could not be hidden. Lucas ran forward first, throwing his arms around the man's waist. Noah stepped in a second later, wrapping his arms around them both. The man crouched slightly, holding the boys close as if making sure they were truly there. For a moment no one spoke. The only sound was the soft wind outside and the quiet hum of the diner heater. Emily felt something warm tighten in her chest as she watched the reunion. After several seconds the man gently pulled back, resting his hands on both boys' shoulders while studying their faces carefully. "Are you both all right?" Noah nodded. "Yes, sir." Lucas answered more quickly. "We stayed here. She helped us." Both boys turned and pointed toward Emily at the counter. The man followed their gaze. His eyes met hers for the first time. There was a brief pause, almost like the moment before a new chapter begins. Emily suddenly felt very aware of the flour on her apron and the spatula still in her hand. She set it down slowly and stepped out from behind the counter. "Good morning," she said politely. "I assume you are their father." The man straightened to his full height and extended his hand. "Daniel Whitmore." Emily shook it gently. The name did not mean much to her yet, but the men standing outside and the line of black vehicles in the parking lot suggested he was someone important. Daniel Whitmore glanced around the diner, then back at her. "My sons have told me you took care of them during the storm." Emily gave a small shrug. They were cold and hungry. Anyone would have done the same. For a moment Daniel studied her expression as if weighing those words carefully. Behind him, several of the men from the convoy had stepped quietly inside, their polished shoes leaving faint wet marks on the floor as they waited near the entrance. The atmosphere in the small diner suddenly felt very different, like the world outside had followed Daniel Whitmore through the door. Lucas tugged lightly on his father's sleeve. "She made us soup and let us sleep in the warm room." Daniel looked down at his sons again, then back at Emily. Something in his expression softened. "You may believe anyone would have done that," he said slowly. "But I assure you, not everyone would." Emily simply smiled politely, unaware that the man standing across from her was not just a worried father. Daniel Whitmore was the founder and chief executive officer of Whitmore Global, one of the largest investment firms in the country. And the entire convoy of vehicles outside had spent the entire night searching the snow-covered highways for the two boys who had quietly found safety in the warm little diner at Willow Creek. Daniel Whitmore remained standing near the entrance for a moment, his tall figure casting a long shadow across the diner floor as the morning sunlight filtered through the windows behind him. The quiet little restaurant suddenly felt much smaller with several sharply dressed men waiting near the door and a line of black SUVs idling outside in the snowy parking lot. Yet despite the presence of wealth and authority that seemed to follow Daniel wherever he went, his attention kept returning to the same person standing calmly behind the counter. Emily Carter. She had already turned back toward the stove, flipping the bacon in the pan as if nothing unusual had just happened. The smell of breakfast filled the room again, warm and ordinary, a sharp contrast to the dramatic scene unfolding outside. Daniel watched her for a moment with a thoughtful expression before speaking again. You said you simply helped them because they needed it. Emily glanced over her shoulder with a small smile. That is usually how helping works. Noah and Lucas had returned to their stools by the counter, finishing the last bites of their breakfast while the men near the entrance quietly observed the room. Lucas looked up proudly at his father. She also gave us blankets and let us sleep in the back room. Noah added calmly. And she did not ask us a lot of questions. Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing every word. For a man who spent most of his days negotiating billion-dollar deals in glass offices overlooking Manhattan, the simplicity of this moment felt strangely powerful. Two cold boys had walked through a door in the middle of a snowstorm, and a stranger had taken care of them without hesitation. No contracts, no conditions, just kindness. Daniel stepped farther into the diner and looked around at the modest space. The worn booths, the faded menu board above the counter, the coffee machine humming steadily beside the register. It was the kind of place most executives in his world would drive past without even noticing. Yet last night it had become the safest place in the entire county for his children. One of the men near the door quietly approached Daniel and spoke in a low voice. Sir, the search teams are confirming the highway section where the vehicle broke down. Local authorities have been notified the boys are safe. Daniel gave a small nod without taking his eyes off Emily. Thank you. The man stepped back again, returning to the entrance. Emily placed a fresh plate of toast in front of Lucas, who had clearly finished his first serving. Growing boys need proper breakfast, she said lightly. Lucas grinned. This is the best breakfast I have had in a long time. Noah gave his brother a knowing look, but said nothing. Daniel walked slowly toward the counter and rested one hand lightly against its polished edge. Up close he could see the small details that revealed a life of hard work. The slightly faded apron, the careful organization of the kitchen tools, the quiet confidence in the way Emily moved through the space she clearly knew so well. Miss Carter, Daniel said thoughtfully. Last night my sons could have knocked on many doors in this town. Emily shrugged gently. But they knocked on this one. Daniel studied her for another moment, and something in his expression shifted again, as if a decision had quietly formed in his mind. Then I believe I owe you more than a simple thank you. Emily wiped her hands on a towel and looked at him curiously. You do not owe me anything, Mr. Whitmore. Your boys are safe. That is enough. For a moment Daniel Whitmore said nothing. He simply glanced at Noah and Luca sitting at the counter, then back at the woman who had taken care of them without expecting anything in return. And somewhere deep inside his mind, a thought began to take shape that would soon surprise everyone inside the quiet diner at Willow Creek. The diner grew quiet again after Daniel Whitmore spoke those last words. Emily Carter stood behind the counter drying a plate with a small white towel, her movements calm and steady, but Daniel could see the curiosity in her eyes. She was trying to understand why a stranger with a convoy of black vehicles and a group of sharply dressed assistants was suddenly studying her like she had become the most important person in the room. Noah and Lucas finished the last bites of their breakfast while watching the two adults carefully. Outside the windows, the bright winter sun reflected off the fresh snow, turning the small parking lot into a field of white light. Daniel rested his hands lightly on the diner counter and spoke again, his voice measured and thoughtful. Miss Carter, may I ask you something? Emily nodded politely. Of course. Daniel glanced briefly toward his sons before looking back at her. When the boys walked through that door last night, you did not know who they were. Emily shook her head. No, you did not know where they came from. No, Daniel continued. And you did not know whether anyone would ever come looking for them. Emily folded the towel neatly and set it beside the coffee machine. No, I just knew two children were freezing during a snowstorm. Daniel nodded slowly, as if confirming something important to himself. And you helped them anyway. Emily gave a small smile. It did not seem like a difficult decision. For a moment Daniel Whitmore did not speak. The men standing near the entrance remained silent as well, watching the conversation with curiosity. They had seen their employer negotiate complex corporate mergers, lead international board meetings, and make decisions that moved billions of dollars across global markets. But they had rarely seen him pause, this long before speaking. Finally, Daniel looked toward Noah and Lucas again. The boys had turned in their stools to face him, their expressions calm but hopeful. Then he looked back at Emily. "Miss Carter," he said slowly, "last night you protected the two most important people in my life." Emily blinked once, clearly not expecting the seriousness in his voice. "I only gave them soup and a warm couch." Daniel shook his head slightly. "You gave them safety." The room fell quiet again. Even the heater seemed to hum more softly in the background. Daniel straightened his coat and spoke in a tone that carried quiet certainty. "In my world, people often help others because they expect something in return." Emily leaned lightly against the counter. "And in my world, people help because it is the right thing to do." Daniel's eyes softened at that answer. "Exactly." Lucas slid off his stool and walked to stand beside his father. "Dad, can we come back here again sometime?" Noah added calmly, "This place is nice." Daniel looked down at them with a faint smile before glancing back at Emily. The thought that had been forming in his mind since he stepped into the diner was now fully clear. He spoke again, his voice calm but firm. "Miss Carter, a woman who would protect my sons the way you did last night deserves far more recognition than a simple thank you." Emily opened her mouth slightly as if about to protest, but Daniel continued before she could speak. "In fact," he said thoughtfully, "a woman with that kind of heart deserves something much greater." Noah and Lucas looked between the two adults, sensing the moment had become important. Daniel Whitmore met Emily's eyes directly, and the next words he spoke would soon leave everyone in the diner completely stunned. Daniel Whitmore's final words hung in the warm diner air like the moment before thunder follows lightning. Emily Carter stood very still behind the counter, the small white towel still resting in her hands, unsure what exactly he meant. The men near the entrance had also gone quiet, exchanging brief glances as if they sensed something unexpected was about to happen. Noah and Lucas looked up at their father with curious expressions, their breakfast plates forgotten on the counter. Daniel took a slow breath and stepped a little closer to Emily. The sunlight from the window caught the silver edge of his watch as he rested one hand against the counter. "Miss Carter," he said calmly, "in my life I have met many people who talk about kindness, but very few who practice it when it truly matters." Emily shifted slightly, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "I was just doing what anyone should do." Daniel shook his head again, his voice steady but thoughtful. "You keep saying that. But the truth is that most people would have closed the door, especially during a storm like last night." Emily did not argue. She simply gave a quiet shrug, the same gesture she had used earlier when Daniel thanked her. For her, the explanation really was that simple. Daniel looked briefly toward his sons. Noah sat straight on the stool, calm as always, while Lucas watched with wide eyes as if waiting to see what would happen next. Then Daniel returned his attention to Emily and spoke the words that surprised everyone in the room. "A woman who would open her door to my sons during a winter storm deserves a place in their lives." Emily blinked, unsure she had heard correctly. Daniel continued before she could respond. "My sons lost their mother several years ago. Since then I have searched for someone who understands what truly matters in life." The men by the door lowered their voices even further, clearly stunned by where the conversation was heading. Daniel's tone remained calm, but there was a quiet certainty behind it now. "Last night you did not know who they were. You did not know who I was. And yet you gave them warmth, food, and safety without hesitation." Emily finally set the towel down beside the coffee machine. "Mr. Whitmore, I think you might be giving me too much credit." Daniel smiled faintly. "No, I believe I am finally giving someone the credit she deserves." Lucas tugged lightly on his father's sleeve. "Dad, what are you saying?" Daniel rested a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder before speaking again. His gray eyes returned to Emily, steady and sincere. "Miss Carter, I would like to offer you something far more meaningful than a reward." Emily folded her arms lightly, still confused. "And what exactly would that be?" Daniel answered without hesitation. "I would like you to become part of our family." The diner fell completely silent. Even the quiet clatter from the kitchen seemed to stop. Emily stared at him for a long second, certain she must have misunderstood the meaning behind those words. Daniel clarified calmly, his voice carrying the same quiet confidence he used in boardrooms filled with executives. In other words, Emily Carter, I would like you to consider becoming my wife. Noah's eyebrows lifted slightly, though he did not look surprised. Lucas, however, nearly slid off his stool in amazement. The men near the entrance exchanged stunned looks. But Daniel Whitmore did not appear to be joking. He stood calmly in the middle of the small diner, looking directly at the waitress who had sheltered his sons during the storm. And for the first time since the convoy of black vehicles had arrived in Willow Creek, Emily Carter was completely speechless. For several seconds, no one inside the diner moved. The quiet room that had smelled of coffee and breakfast only moments earlier now held a different kind of tension, the kind that appears when something completely unexpected changes the direction of a day. Emily Carter stood behind the counter staring at Daniel Whitmore, as if she were trying to determine whether he was serious or simply testing her reaction. The sunlight outside continued to reflect off the bright snow, filling the windows with soft white light, but inside the diner the world seemed to pause. Lucas was the first to break the silence. Dad, did you just ask her to marry you? His voice carried the kind of amazed curiosity only a child could express without hesitation. Daniel glanced down at his son with a faint smile before returning his attention to Emily. Yes, he answered simply. Emily exhaled slowly, finally finding her voice again. Mr. Whitmore, I think you might be moving a little fast. The men standing near the entrance tried very hard not to react, though several of them exchanged quiet looks that suggested they had never seen their employer propose marriage inside a roadside diner before. Daniel nodded thoughtfully, clearly expecting that response. Perhaps, he admitted. But sometimes life makes certain things obvious very quickly. Emily leaned lightly against the counter, still processing everything that had happened in the last 10 minutes. Less than an hour earlier, she had simply been cooking breakfast for two boys who had walked through the door during a snowstorm. Now, their father, a man whose convoy of vehicles filled her parking lot, was calmly asking her to become part of his family. She looked toward Noah and Lucas. Lucas smiled at her with the same bright expression he had worn since breakfast began. Noah simply watched quietly, thoughtful as always. Emily turned back to Daniel. Mr. Whitmore, you do not really know anything about me. Daniel answered calmly. I know the most important thing already. Emily raised an eyebrow slightly. And what would that be? Daniel gestured gently toward the boys. You saw two children in trouble and chose kindness without hesitation. Emily considered that for a moment before responding. That does not mean I am ready to marry someone I met 5 minutes ago. Daniel laughed softly, the sound surprising everyone in the room. Fair point. He rested one hand on the counter again, his voice gentler now. Then allow me to say it differently. Emily waited. Daniel continued, his tone sincere. I am not asking for an answer today. I am asking for the opportunity to know you better. To let my sons know you better. And perhaps, if time proves that my instincts are correct, to build something meaningful together. Emily studied his face carefully. For the first time she saw something beyond the confident businessman who had walked into her diner earlier. She saw a father who had spent a long night searching for his children through a winter storm. She saw someone who valued what had happened inside this small building more than any business deal waiting for him in a city far away. Lucas looked up at her hopefully. You should visit us sometime. We have a really big kitchen too. Emily could not help smiling at that. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked around the counter, stopping a few feet from Daniel and the boys. All right, she said finally. One visit. Daniel's expression brightened slightly. That is all I am asking. Outside, the engines of the waiting vehicles continued to idle quietly in the snow. Inside the small diner at Willow Creek, the morning had returned to something close to normal again. But one thing had quietly changed forever. Sometimes the most important doors in life do not open in boardrooms or grand buildings. Sometimes they open in small diners on snowy mornings, when a simple act of kindness reminds everyone in the room that the quietest hearts often carry the greatest strength.